The Kovathi had ruled this region of space for 300 years, and they had never known defeat in all that time. Their empire stretched across 47 star systems, and their warships numbered in the thousands, and every species that had ever challenged them had been crushed without mercy. Supreme Commander Kethrol stood on the observation deck of his flagship and watched the stars with the calm confidence of a predator who had never met anything stronger than himself. His people had conquered the Morthani and broken the Sisterhood of Vale and reduced a dozen other species to client status, and the universe had taught them one simple lesson over and over again: the strong ruled and the weak served, and that was the natural order of things. When the scout ships first detected the human colony vessels at the edge of Kovathi space, the military council barely paid attention. The reports described a young species that had only been traveling between stars for about 2 centuries, and their ships were small, and their technology was unremarkable, and they seemed to pose no threat whatsoever. Ambassador Arelkin was sent to deliver the standard terms of submission, and he expected the whole matter to be resolved within a single day. The human diplomatic delegation met him on a neutral station, and Arelkin looked at them with barely hidden contempt. They were soft creatures with no claws and no natural armor and no visible weapons built into their bodies, and he could not understand how such fragile beings had even survived on their home world. He delivered his message with the casual arrogance of someone who had done this many times before. Humanity would surrender all colonies in the contested region immediately, and they would submit to biological cataloging so the hegemony could determine their usefulness, and they would accept permanent client species status under Kovathi protection. In exchange, the Kovathi would allow them to continue existing. Urelican expected fear or anger or desperate negotiation, because that was what every other species had shown when faced with the might of the hegemony. Instead, the humans simply listened in silence. Their leader was a woman named Admiral Helena Vasquez, and she had gray hair and calm eyes, and she sat perfectly still while Arelkin spoke. When he finished, she looked at him for a long moment, and then she smiled. It was not a friendly smile. "We decline," she said, and her voice was quiet, but it carried across the room like the edge of a blade. "You have 30 standard cycles to evacuate your forward bases in the Verth expanse, and if you do not leave, we will remove you ourselves." Arelkin stared at her in disbelief, and then he laughed. He laughed for a long time, because the idea of this small, weak species threatening the Kovathi hegemony was the most absurd thing he had ever heard. "You have perhaps 100 warships," he said, when he could speak again. "We have 12,000, and your technology is primitive, and your people are soft, and you think you can threaten us." Admiral Vasquez stood up, and the other humans stood with her, and they moved with a coordination that Arelkin found strangely unsettling. "We have been watching you," she said. "We have been watching you for a very long time, and we have studied every battle you have ever fought, and we know exactly how you think and how you plan and how you react when things go wrong." She walked toward the door and then stopped and looked back at him. "You have made one very serious mistake, Ambassador, and that mistake is going to cost your people everything." Arelkin felt a chill run down his spine despite himself. "What mistake?" he asked. "You assumed we were like every other species you have encountered," Vasquez said. "You assumed we would be afraid, and you assumed we would submit, and you assumed wrong." She left the station, and Arelkin immediately sent his report to the High Command, and they laughed just as he had laughed. The Kovathi began moving their forces toward the human colonies, and they expected a quick and easy victory. They had no idea what was coming on. The human side of the border, Admiral Vasquez returned to her flagship, the Dreadnought Unconditional Surrender, and she gathered her senior officers for a final briefing. "They took the bait," she said. "They think we are weak, and they think this will be easy, and that is exactly what we wanted them to think." Captain James Okonkwo looked at the tactical display and shook his head in amazement. 3 years of planning, he said. 3 years of building ships in secret and training crews and developing new weapons, and they have no idea any of it exists. Vasquez nodded, and her eyes were hard. Humanity has been fighting wars since before we could write, she said. We spent thousands of years killing each other over land and resources and ideology, and we got very, very good at it. She pulled up an image of the Corvathi fleet formations and pointed at the screen. They have never faced an enemy like us, because every species they conquered was peaceful by nature, and those species only learned to fight when they had to, and they learned from scratch. She smiled that cold smile again. We did not have that luxury, and we have been practicing for this moment since the first human picked up a rock and threw it at another human. The communication officer interrupted with a message from Earth, and Vasquez read it in silence, and then she nodded. Condition. Black is authorized, she said. The full fleet is mobilized, and every ship we have is moving into position, and in 30 days. The Corvathi are going to learn what happens when you threaten humanity. She looked around the room at her officers, and she saw no fear in their eyes, only determination, only readiness, only the cold, hard resolve of a species that had been forged in the fire of 10,000 wars. Send the signal to all fleet commanders, Vasquez said. Tell them to begin final preparations. And tell them that when we move fast, and we move hard, and we do not stop until the enemy is completely destroyed. Captain Okonkwo nodded and began transmitting the orders across human space. Thousands of warships powered up their engines and loaded their weapons and prepared for the greatest battle their species had ever fought. The Corvathi were still laughing at the foolish humans who dared to challenge them. They would not be laughing for much longer. The Corvathi forward staging area at Nexus Station Theta 7 was the largest military installation in the sector, and it housed over 800 warships and 50,000 soldiers. Commander Valthus was in charge of the station, and he had been told to expect a small human attack force within the next few days. His superiors believed the humans would send perhaps 100 ships and maybe 200 at most, and his job was to crush them quickly and completely as a lesson to the rest. Of their species, Vetos was bored by the assignment because he saw no challenge in defeating such a primitive enemy. He sat in his command chair and watched the sensor displays with half-closed eyes, and his crew went about their duties with casual indifference. Then the alarms started screaming. Velthos sat up straight and stared at the tactical display, and for a moment he thought the sensors must be malfunctioning. Ships were appearing at the edge of the system, and they kept appearing and appearing. How many? He demanded. His sensor officer was pale, and his hands were shaking. 3,000, Commander, the officer said. 3,000 warships, and they are all heading directly toward us. Valthus felt his heart stop in his chest. 3,000 ships was more than the Corvathi had ever deployed in a single battle, and these humans were supposed to be a minor species with limited resources. That is impossible, he said. They cannot have that many ships, but the sensors did not lie, and the human fleet continued to advance in perfect formation. The ships moved with a precision that Valthus had never seen before, and they spread across space like a wave of steel and fire. At the head of the formation was a massive dreadnought, and it was broadcasting a message on all frequencies. This is Admiral Vasquez of the United Human Fleet. The message said, you have 60 seconds to power down your weapons and lower your shields. And if you do not comply, we will destroy you completely, and there will be no second warning. Valthus stared at the display in shock, and then his training took over, and he began issuing orders. All ships power up weapons and raise shields, he commanded. Form defensive positions around the station and prepare to repel the enemy. His fleet responded quickly, but he could see the fear in his officers as they watched the human armada approaching. The 60 seconds passed, and the humans did not slow down. Valthus gave the order to open fire, and 800 Corvathi warships unleashed their weapons at the advancing enemy. The first wave of human ships took the full force of the barrage, and dozens of them exploded in brilliant flashes of light. But the rest did not stop. They did not even slow down. They accelerated directly into the Kavati formation with a speed and aggression that Velthus had never encountered before. "They are insane," he whispered. The human ships returned fire, and their weapons were not more powerful than Kavati weapons, but they fired faster and more accurately. Every Kavati ship that was hit multiple times from multiple angles, and the coordinated attacks tore through shields and armor with devastating efficiency. Valas watched in horror as his fleet began to crumble. The humans used tactics that made no sense to him, and their smaller ships deliberately rammed damaged Kavati vessels to ensure their destruction, and the crews ejected into space just before impact, trusting their own fleet to recover them later. "They sacrificed themselves," his tactical officer said with disbelief in his voice. "They throw away their own ships like they mean nothing." Velthus understood then what he was facing. The Kavati valued their ships and their crews, because replacing them was expensive and time-consuming, and every loss was felt deeply. The humans apparently did not share this concern. They fought like a species that had unlimited resources and unlimited willpower, and they pressed forward, no matter how many of their own ships were destroyed. The battle lasted 4 hours, and it was not really a battle at all. It was a massacre. Velthos watched his fleet die around him, and he ordered a retreat, but the humans pursued with relentless determination. His flagship was the last Kavati vessel still fighting, and he stood on his bridge as the human ships surrounded him. Admiral Vasquez appeared on his view screen, and her face was calm and cold. "You had your chance to surrender," she said. "You chose to fight instead, and now you have seen what that choice costs." Lalthus straightened his spine and faced her with what dignity he had left. "Why?" he asked. "Why do you fight like this, and why do you sacrifice so many of your own people?" Vasquez was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke her voice was soft, but there was steel underneath. "Because we have learned that half measures lead to long wars," she said. "We have learned that mercy toward an enemy who will not surrender only leads to more death in the end. And we have learned that the fastest way to end a fight is to hit so hard that the enemy cannot get back up." She leaned forward. "Your species has been a bully for 300 years, Commander, and you have never met anyone who was willing to pay the price to stop you until now." Valthus had no response to that. "Your station is destroyed, and your fleet is gone, and you can die here or you can surrender and tell your superiors what happened today," Vasquez said. "Choose." Valthus closed his eyes and thought about his duty and his honor. And then he thought about the terrible efficiency with which the humans had dismantled everything he commanded. "I surrender," he said. Vasquez nodded. "Smart choice," she said. "Your superiors will want to hear your report, because this is just the beginning, Commander, and what happened here today is going to happen everywhere your forces try to stand against us." She cut the communication, and Volthus slumped in his chair. He had served the hegemony for 40 years, and he had never imagined defeat was possible. Now, he knew better. The humans had shown him something that his species had forgotten over 3 centuries of easy victories. War was not a game, and it was not a tool for intimidation. War was destruction and chaos and horror, and the humans understood that better than any species the Kavathi had ever encountered. As his ship was taken under escort, Valthus wondered if the High Command would listen to his warning. He hoped they would, because if they did not, then everything the Kavathi had built was going to burn. The reports came flooding into Korvathi High Command like a river of disaster, and each new message brought worse news than the last nexus. Station Theta 7 had fallen in 4 hours, and the fleet there was completely destroyed. The garrison at Velkar Prime had been overrun by human marines, who fought in conditions that should have killed any oxygen-breathing species. Patrol groups in the outer sectors had been hunted down one by human wolfpack squadrons that appeared from nowhere. and vanished before reinforcements could arrive. Supreme Commander Kethro stood before the strategic display and watched his empire crumble in real time. "This is impossible," he said for the 10th time that day. "They are a young species with limited resources and primitive technology, and they cannot be doing this." His intelligence chief Morvex approached with a data tablet, and her expression was grim. "I have found something, Commander," she said. "Something that explains what we are facing." Kethro turned to her with desperate hope in his eyes. "Tell me," he demanded. Morvex pulled up the data on the main display, and images of human history appeared on the screen. "We assumed they were like the other species we have conquered," she said. "We assumed. They developed space travel and then learned to fight when they encountered threats in the galaxy, but we were wrong." She showed him images of ancient human battles with swords and spears and arrows. "They have been fighting each other since before. They developed writing," she said. "They spent thousands of years in constant warfare against their own kind." The images shifted to show more recent conflicts with tanks and aircraft and nuclear weapons. They developed weapons capable of destroying their entire planet, and they still did not stop fighting. Morvex continued. "They refined the art of war against the most dangerous opponent they could ever face." Kethro stared at the images with growing horror. "Themselves," he whispered. "Yes, Commander." Morvex said, "Every tactic we have ever developed was designed to defeat enemies who learned to fight out of necessity, and those enemies were predictable because they all learned the same basic lessons." She pulled up recordings from the recent battles and pointed at the human ship movements. "The humans did not learn to fight out of necessity," she said. "They fought because it was in their nature, and they have been practicing for this moment for 10,000 years." Kethro watched the recordings, and he saw what she meant. The humans adapted to Korvathi tactics within hours, and strategies that worked in the morning failed completely by afternoon. They used deception and misdirection and psychological warfare in ways that the Korvathi had never encountered. Most disturbing of all, they broadcast the names of the dead from every species the hegemony had conquered, and the voices of those victims echoed across every Korvathi communication channel. It was a message, and the message was simple: "We know what you have done, and we are here to make you pay." "What do we do?" Kethro asked, and for the first time in his long career, his voice held a note of fear. Morvex shook her head. "I do not know, Commander," she said. "We have never faced an enemy like this before." Across the Verith expanse, the human fleet continued its advance, and nothing the Korvathi did could slow it down. Fleet Commander Yathro tried to ambush a human battle group in the asteroid fields of Sector 7, and the humans turned his trap against him and destroyed his entire force. Commodore Velshin attempted a fighting retreat toward the inner systems, and human pursuit ships ran her fleet down and gave no quarter to those who refused to surrender. Governor Kethmal ordered his planetary defense forces to dig in and prepare for a siege, and human drop pods rained from the sky like metal hail, and his soldiers were overwhelmed within hours. The humans fought on the ground with the same terrifying efficiency they showed in space, and their Marines were relentless and fearless and utterly committed to victory. Stories spread through the Korvathi military about human soldiers who continued fighting even with mortal wounds, and about officers who led from the front instead of commanding from safe positions in the rear. One report described a human captain who ordered his ship to ram a Korvathi carrier after his weapons were destroyed, and the captain stayed at his post until the moment of impact, and the carrier was torn in half. Another report told of human Marines who held a bridge for 6 hours against overwhelming odds because their commander had ordered them to hold it, and they simply refused to die until reinforcements arrived. Korvathi had always believed that their warrior culture was superior to all others, and they had always believed that their discipline and training could not be matched. Now they learned the truth: humanity had been forged in a crucible of endless War and their culture was built on the bones of 1,000 conflicts, and every lesson they had ever learned was written in blood. 17 days after the first battle, the human fleet reached the edge of the Karath system, and Supreme Commander Kethro gathered every ship that could still fly for a final stand. 6,000 Korvathi warships formed a defensive line around their homeworld, and Kethro broadcast a message to his people. "Today we fight for our survival," he said. "Today we show these humans that the Korvathi do not surrender, and we do not break, and we will never bow to an enemy." His fleet responded with cheers and battle cries, and for a moment, Kethro felt a spark of hope. Then the human fleet appeared on the sensors, and hope died. 1,800 human warships emerged from hyperspace, and many of them were damaged from the campaign, and their hulls were scarred, and their weapons were running at reduced capacity. But they had come, every single ship that could. Still fight had come, and at the head of the formation, the Dreadnought, Unconditional Surrender, led the way with Admiral Vasquez standing on the bridge. "All ships," she said, "begin the attack." The final battle for the Korvathi hegemony had begun. The battle that followed would become known in human military academies as the 17-Hour War, and it would be studied for centuries as an example of what happens when an unstoppable force meets an enemy that refuses to move. Supreme Commander Kethro had 6,000 ships, and he had the defensive advantage, and he had the desperate courage of a species fighting for its survival. Admiral Vasquez had 1,800 ships, and many of them were damaged, and her crews were exhausted from weeks of constant combat. By every measure of conventional military wisdom, the Korvathi should have won. They did not win. The human fleet advanced in a formation that Kethro had never seen before, and his tactical officers could not predict what they would do next. The humans used their damaged ships as shields for their more capable vessels, and they rotated their forces constantly so that fresh crews were always on the front line. They targeted Korvathi command ships with surgical precision, and every time a Korvathi commander felt the ships under their command lost coordination for precious seconds. In those seconds, the humans struck a thrall, watched his fleet die around him, and he ordered counterattack after counterattack, but nothing worked. The humans seemed to know what he would do before he did it, and every trap he set was avoided, and every ambush he planned was turned against him. By the 5th hour, he had lost 2,000 ships, and the human fleet had lost 600, but they kept coming. By the 10th hour, he had lost 4,000 ships, and the human fleet had lost 900, but they kept coming. By the 15th hour, he had lost 5,000 ships, and the human fleet was battered and bleeding, but they kept coming. "Why will they not stop?" Kethro screamed at his officers. "Why do they keep fighting when they have lost so many?" His tactical officer was pale, and his voice was hollow. "Because they do not care about losses, Commander," the officer said. "They only care about victory." Kethro stared at the display, and he saw the truth of those words. Human ships that were crippled and burning continued to fire their weapons until the last moment. Human crews that could have retreated to save themselves instead drove their vessels into the heart of the Korvathi formation. Human captains gave orders with calm voices even as their bridges exploded around them. It was not courage in the way the Korvathi understood courage. It was something else. It was a cold mechanical determination that saw death as an acceptable price for victory, and that refused to acknowledge the possibility of defeat. Kethro had one final option left. His flagship carried a prototype weapon that the Korvathi had developed in secret, and it was designed to destroy entire fleets with a single blast. He had been ordered to save it for emergencies, and he could not imagine a greater emergency than this. "Power up the resonance cannon," he ordered. "Target the center of the human formation and fire when ready." His weapons officer hesitated. "Commander, that weapon has never been tested in combat," the officer said. "We do not know if it will work." Kethro bared his teeth. "It will work, or we will die," he said. "Those are our only options now." The resonance cannon charged for 3 agonizing minutes, and Kethril watched the human fleet continue its advance and prayed to every god he knew. Weapon fired a beam of pure energy lanced across space toward the human formation, and for a moment it seemed like everything would change. Then the beam struck a wall of debris. Somehow, the humans had known about the weapon, and they had positioned the wreckage of destroyed ships in the path of the beam, and the energy dissipated harmlessly against twisted metal and shattered hulls. Kethril stared in disbelief. How? He whispered. How did they know? On the bridge of the unconditional surrender, Admiral Vasquez allowed herself a small smile. Intelligence wins wars. She said to her officers, "We knew about their secret weapon 3 years ago, and we planned for it from the beginning." She turned to her communications officer. "Open a channel to the Corvathi flagship." She ordered. Kethril's face appeared on her screen, and he looked like a broken man. "Your fleet is destroyed," Vasquez said. "Your secret weapon has failed, and your homeworld is defenseless, and we can continue this until there is nothing left of your civilization, or you can surrender now." She leaned forward, and her eyes were hard as steel. "Choose," she said. Kethril looked around his bridge at the officers who had served him faithfully, and he looked at the tactical display that showed the burning remnants of his once mighty fleet. He had been a warrior all his life, and he had never surrendered to anyone. But he was also responsible for billions of Corvathi lives, and continuing this fight would only lead to their extinction. "What are your terms?" he asked. Vasquez nodded. "Unconditional surrender," she said. "Your military forces will stand down immediately, and your government will submit to human oversight until a permanent peace treaty can be negotiated, and all species you have conquered will be given their freedom." Kethril closed his eyes. "And if I refuse?" he asked. "Then we continue fighting until you are all dead." Vasquez said, "We have come too far to turn back now, Commander, and we will pay whatever price is necessary to finish this." Kethril believed her. He had watched her fleet sacrifice ship after ship to reach this moment, and he knew she was not bluffing. "I accept your terms," he said. "The Corvathi hegemony surrenders unconditionally." Vasquez nodded once. "A wise decision, Commander," she said. "Broadcast the order to your remaining forces, and this war is over." Kethril gave the order, and across the Karath system, Corvathi ships powered down their weapons and lowered their shields. The 17-hour war was finished. The Corvathi hegemony had been the dominant power in this region of space for 3 centuries, and humanity had broken them in 17 days. And the unconditional surrender, the crew began to cheer. But Vasquez silenced them with a raised hand. "The fighting is over," she said. "But our work is not finished, and what we do next will determine what kind of species we truly are." She looked out at the stars and the burning wreckage of 2 fleets, and she thought about all the lives that had been lost. "We came here to end a threat," she said. "Now we have to build something better in its place." 1 year had passed since the Corvathi surrender, and the galaxy was still trying to understand what had happened to a species that had only been traveling between stars for 2 centuries, had defeated the most powerful military force in the known universe, and they had done it in less than 3 weeks. Every civilization that received the news reacted with shock and fear, because they all asked the same question: what would humanity do with their victory? History had taught the galaxy what conquerors did, and every species that had ever won a war had expanded their territory and enslaved the defeated and taken whatever resources they wanted. The Corvathi had done exactly that for 300 years. But humanity did something different. Admiral Vasquez became military governor of the former hegemony territories, and her first order was to begin immediate humanitarian relief efforts. Human ships that had been carrying weapons a month ago now carried food and medicine and construction equipment. Human soldiers who had been fighting on the ground were now helping rebuild cities they had destroyed. Human engineers worked alongside Corvathi workers to repair infrastructure and restore essential services. The galaxy watched in confusion as humanity treated their defeated enemy with respect and compassion. Ambassador Chun addressed the newly formed Galactic Assembly 1 year after the war ended, and representatives from 43 species listened to her words. "We did not come to the stars to build an empire," she said. "We came because we were alone on our world for so long, and we looked up at the night sky and wondered if anyone else was out there." She paused and looked around the chamber at the assembled delegates. "We found others," she continued. "Some wanted to be friends and some wanted to enslave us, and we have shown what happens when you choose the latter." The Kovathi delegate shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "But we would rather show you what happens when you choose friendship," Chun said. "We have libraries to share and music and art and stories, and we have hands willing to help and minds eager to learn." She smiled, and it was a warm, genuine smile that held no threat. "We are humanity, and we would very much like to not be alone anymore." The speech was broadcast across the galaxy, and billions of beings watched and listened and tried to understand this strange new species on Karath Prime. A young Karvati named Velthan watched the broadcast with his family, and he remembered the day the human ships had appeared in the sky. He had been terrified, and he had expected death or slavery or worse instead. Human aid workers had brought food to his neighborhood when the supply lines collapsed. Human doctors had treated his grandmother when she fell ill. Human teachers had come to his school to help rebuild the educational system that the war had disrupted. Velthan did not understand why the humans were doing these things, and his father said it was a trick to make the Kovathi weak, but his grandmother disagreed. "They are showing us who they really are," she said. "They could have destroyed us completely, and instead they chose to help us, and that tells you everything you need to know about them." Velthan thought about her words as he watched Ambassador Chun speak, and he wondered if she was right. Across the former hegemony territories, similar scenes played out every day. Species that the Korvathi had conquered for generations were now free for the first time in centuries. The Morthani rebuilt their temples and practiced their religion without fear. The Sisterhood of Vale reclaimed their ancestral worlds and began healing from generations of oppression. A dozen other species that had been reduced to servitude under Korvathi rule now had the chance to determine their own futures, and humanity asked for nothing in return. Admiral Vasquez gave her final report to the United Human Command before returning to Earth, and she spoke about what she had learned during her year as military governor. "We won the war in 17 days, she said, "but we will be winning the peace for generations, and what we do now matters more than any battle we ever fought." She showed images of Kovathi children attending schools rebuilt with human help, and of former slaves returning to homeworlds they had not seen in decades. "Our weapons made them fear us," she said. "Our actions after the war will make them trust us, and trust is more valuable than fear." In the long run, the Galactic Cooperative was founded 6 months later, and humanity was invited to be a founding member. It was the first time in galactic history that a species had been welcomed into a major political organization based on their conduct after a war rather than their military strength. Ambassador Chun signed the charter on behalf of humanity, and she was surrounded by delegates from dozens of species, including several former Kovathi officials. Supreme Commander Kethril attended the ceremony as an observer, and he watched Chen sign her name with complicated emotions. He had lost everything to the humans and his fleet, and his empire and his pride had all been destroyed. But he had also seen what came after the destruction. He had seen human soldiers sharing meals with Korvathi civilians. He had seen human engineers teaching young Korvathi how to build better ships. He had seen human musicians performing alongside Korvathi artists in concerts that celebrated both cultures. That humans had shown him something that he had never believed possible. Victory did not have to mean domination and strength, did not have to mean cruelty. After the ceremony, Kethral approached Ambassador Chun and he struggled to find the right words. "I do not understand your species," he admitted. "We tried to enslave you, and you crushed us completely, and then you helped us rebuild, and why would you do that?" Chum smiled at him. "Because we know what it is like to be broken," she said. "We have broken each other many times throughout our history, and we have learned that the only way to truly end a conflict is to build something better together." She offered him her hand in a human gesture of friendship. "We would rather have you as partners than as subjects, Commander, and the galaxy is big enough for all of us." Kethro looked at her hand, and he remembered all the Kovathi who had died fighting her fleet. Then he remembered all the Kovathi who were alive today because of human aid. He took her hand. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "perhaps we can learn from each other." Chum nodded. "That is all we have ever wanted," she said. The galaxy continued to turn and new challenges arose and old tensions flared in distant corners of space. But something had changed. Humanity had proven that there was another way to be strong, and that victory could mean lifting others up instead of pushing them down. It was not a lesson that every species would learn immediately, and it was not a path that would always be easy to follow, but it was a beginning, and for a species that had spent 10,000 years fighting each other only to reach the stars and find new enemies to face, a beginning was enough.